The roar of engines died away slowly as the final dropship lifted away into the stratosphere. It traced a thin line skyward, leaving a white trail of smoke behind it, shrinking further and further. It was not a triumphant exit. The Kungsarmé 2nd Cavalry, or at least what remained of it, was leaving Lothan in disgrace. The small, under-equipped unit had tried to make a good fight, but they had been no match for the invaders who had driven them from their world, the Alpha Galaxy of Clan Wolf. They had lost at Saldana, then again at Tronsk, and once more at Kandalaksha, all without so much as slowing the advance of the clan. These had not been battles, not in the true sense of the word. They had been routs. The 1st Lothan Brigade had folded completely and was effectively wiped out within hours of first contact, and as it was, only a handful of the 2nd Cavalry had made it through the Kandalaksha Valley in the Stennig Labyrinth to the extraction point. Far below the departing dropship, a single battlemech stood alone on a rocky outcrop, watching the ship as it left Lothan at the mercy of the invaders. The battlemech, a humble fire starter, leaned unsteadily on its shredded left leg like a soldier on the verge of collapse. Its pilot sat in stone-cold silence, and he held the controls with a white-knuckled grip. He ground his teeth together until the pain became too much to bear. Tears threatened to escape from the corners of his eyes. When the final trace of the dropship disappeared, he shut down his machine and began his descent from the cockpit. It wasn't far to the ground. The light mech was diminutive compared to most others, and he reached it with little difficulty. He took a few steps back and stared up at his vehicle. The fire starter was barely functional. The left leg was a mangled pile of steel and tangled myomer. The armor had melted away and formed surrealistic stalactites on the limbs. The proud gray, red, and cyan livery had been singed black, and the serpent insignia of the Free Rasselhag Republic had been sliced in half by a stray laser strike. It was an apt scrap of damage, the man thought to himself. He didn't react to the voice that called his name from further down the hill. "Caspian! Caspian, are you all right?" A woman approached Caspian Muldoon from behind, a close friend and fellow soldier, but Caspian couldn't bring himself to look at her. His gaze was rooted to the broken battlemech. The woman drew alongside him and placed her hand on his shoulder, but he still didn't move. The two stood there in silence for a minute, lost in the enormity of the past few days, until finally Caspian broke the silence, his voice pulled tight with restrained emotion. "It's all gone, Amberly," he said. "Everything. All of it." "I know," Amberly Grimsdaughter replied gently. "It all happened so fast." "I don't understand," Caspian continued. "Who are they? Why did they do this to us? Where the hell did they come from?" He shook his head. "None of it makes any sense. A week ago I was..." His voice trailed off and he hung his head, his shoulders now shuddering. He was fighting with all his might to contain the surge of grief and rage. The emotions swirled within him like a hurricane, and his words refused to come forward. Amberly's hold on his shoulder tightened. "None of it feels real," she said. "I keep feeling like I'm going to wake up and everything will be back to normal. Then I look out at Saldana and see the smoke." "They won't get away with this," Caspian snarled. "I won't let them. Not while..." He cut himself short as he caught a flash in the corner of his eye. A red strobe had begun to throb in the cockpit, and the polarized canopy glistened with the crimson light. Caspian clambered up what remained of the handholds, clawing his way through the shredded portions of the battlemech until he retook the cockpit and climbed inside. Amberly watched from outside, curious about what had caused the light, but not willing to risk the treacherous climb. For nearly a full minute there was no sound but the wind and the mournful songs of the evening birds. Amberly folded her arms around herself. The sun was beginning to slip behind the mountains, and the Lothanian autumn was just about to begin. She was wearing very little, clad only in the bare essentials. It was necessary in the stifling heat of a battlemech's cockpit, but now it was quickly becoming a liability. She began to shiver as the cold began to run through her. She sank to the ground and seated herself, curling up into as small a form as possible to conserve her body heat. Her mind wandered, and she began to ponder the day's events, but the thought of the fields that lay behind her strewn with the corpses of men and machines alike was too much to bear. Never before in her life had she felt a misery so all-encompassing. Amberly wanted to sink into the earth, perhaps burst into tears and melt away, but she lacked even the strength to cry. She sat there, freezing and crestfallen, until she heard an elated whoop from up above. Caspian emerged from the cockpit with a small item in his hand. It was hard to make out in the failing light, but it was most likely a data disk from the Firestarter's onboard computer. Caspian waved it above his head like a trophy, his face beaming with newfound enthusiasm. He scrambled back down to the earth, snatched up Amberly's wrists, and hauled her back to her feet. "A transmission from the dropship!" he cried. "The second Cav left us a little gift." "What's in it?" asked Amberly. "Code, mostly," Caspian replied. "You still remember your ciphers?" "Somebody had to," said Amberly. "I can see if I can remember enough to translate it." "I still remember a bit," said Caspian. "Not as much as I should, but enough to recognize a set of coordinates and access codes. They've given us the keys to Outpost 6. "Outpost 6?" echoed Amberly. She shook her head. "Caspian, Outpost 6 is on the other side of Saldana. The clans hold that area now. We couldn't get there even if we were at full strength. We'll never make it." "We will," Caspian insisted. "There's instructions on the disk, but I need to find a proper terminal somewhere to access them. It's the emergency orders, contingency 0. If we can get the correct set of orders from the code block, it'll tell us what to do. Clans won't find Outpost 6. It's our only shot. You still have your mech?" "If I did, you think I'd have walked here?" Amberly retorted. "No, my urban mech went critical and I had to punch out. There's nothing left of it now." "Damn. What about the rest of Mage Lance?" "I lost track of Bjorn and Halvar, but when I punched out, they were still rolling. I'm not sure what happened to them after that. Greta..." Amberly shuddered as she remembered the sight of Greta's VTOL. It had been hit early on in the engagement. The aircraft had been flying low enough that its pilot had survived the crash, but she'd been unable to escape the inferno that followed. Her agonized scream still rang in Amberly's ears. "Greta didn't make it." "Damn," Caspian repeated. He began to pace back and forth. He rubbed furiously at the back of his head and racked his brain for ideas. "Right, so it's just you, me, and what's left of this Firestarter. There's got to be others hiding out there around here somewhere. 1st Brigade, 2nd Cav, maybe a few police units. Contingency 0 probably has a way to contact them, but first we have to get to the outpost." He stopped pacing and rapped his knuckles on the Firestarter's mangled leg. "Will be a lot harder to track without the mech. We'll have to hide it and come back for it later." "We'll stick out even without the mech," said Amberly. "If you haven't noticed, neither of us are dressed for the weather." Caspian blinked and looked down at himself. Like Amberly, he was nearly naked. The 2nd Cavalry had lacked the funding to afford luxuries like cooling vests, and so their mech warriors relied on more low-tech solutions. They were dressed for the beach, but were standing no less than 100 miles away from the nearest body of water. Caspian thought for a moment and snapped his fingers. "The Aderic farm's nearby," he said. "You remember Bruno and Helga Aderic, my father's old squad mates? I'm sure they could get us some civilian clothes. Might even let us hide the Firestarter in their barn if we asked nicely enough." He clapped his hands together and smiled at Amberly. "We've got a chance, Grim. It's a small one, but we can make it work. Come on, we can't waste any more time." Caspian began to crawl his way back up the Firestarter's leg. Amberly rushed to the footpad and called up after him. "What exactly are you planning to do?" "I'm going to fight, Grim," Caspian called back. "This isn't over. Not while I'm still breathing. These bastards want to rip our world away from us. Well, I'm going to make sure that they're built accordingly." The world of Lothan sat squarely within the shattered remnants of the Free Rasselhog Republic. It was a planet of little significance, and for centuries it had served as little more than a stepping stone for conquering armies. It had felt the iron boot heel of the Lyran Commonwealth and the Draconis Combine alike, and its people were no strangers to the contempt with which they were so often held. The newborn Republic had finally granted them a sense of pride and dignity, a chance to finally determine their own futures for themselves. After centuries of resistance movements and uprisings with questionable degrees of success, they had at long last been granted their independence. Lothanians were proud of their past and excited for their future, but the dream had been too intoxicating to last. The sudden appearance of Clans Wolf and Ghost Bear had dashed their hopes. The clans had attacked without warning, appearing from the void and claiming every world they saw as their own. The North Sphere and Periphery had been fractured as they made a mad dash toward the very heart of the Inner Sphere, and the point of their spear thrust had landed directly through the center of the fledgling nation. The Free Rasselhog Republic had existed for a mere 18 years, and 5 years after the invasion, it controlled no more than 7 planets. The rump state that remained wielded no power, held little territory, and its economy was in shambles. For worlds like Lothan, the collapse of the Republic was a crippling blow, and life under clan occupation had been a cruel reawakening for many. Most were old enough to remember life under the oppressive jackboot of the Draconis Combine, and the vitriolic hatred they had come to possess for outsiders led to widespread discontent. Civil unrest had swept through Lothan's cities like wildfire, and even half a decade after the conquest, the clan garrison was struggling to establish order. Productivity was less than a quarter of what had been expected, with barely enough being produced to sustain the world. Exports were virtually non-existent, and the planet was rapidly becoming a liability. Military resources were also being drained slowly but steadily. An insurgency had sprung up from the splintered remnants of the Kung's army that had been left behind during the evacuation, and they had proven surprisingly difficult to manage. It was this state of affairs that had demanded the attention of Star Colonel Thomas Moran, and the aging warrior had opted to inspect the world personally. His arrival had been greatly anticipated, and it was with equal amounts of relief and trepidation that Star Captain Christina Danvers awaited the landing of his dropship at the Saldana spaceport. As the spherical vessel touched down on the pad, she waved her hand, and an armored car drove into position. Infantry marched in formation to surround the vehicle, but it was not the usual ceremonial gesture. They were armed and dressed in full combat gear, and when they reached their positions they each took a knee with their rifles aimed outward. A star of battle mechs stood guard around the perimeter, with 2 points of elementals in reserve. The boarding ramp swung lazily downward until it met the concrete pad with a resounding thump, and the infantry immediately began to sprint up the incline. They formed a wall of bodies on either side, giving the Star Colonel a shielded path to the motorcade. Danvers watched Moran as he began his descent, but her blood boiled when she realized that he wasn't alone. He had brought Damien with him. Danvers cursed under her breath. The young Rystar had appeared out of nowhere barely 2 years prior, and already he had landed himself firmly in the Star Colonel's graces. He was known to be a ferocious mech warrior, valiant in battle and fiercely intellectual, and he was acutely aware of his own advantages. Danvers despised the upstart with every cell in her body. It was no secret that Star Colonel Moran was grooming the young warrior to be his successor, traditions be damned. Danvers had fought for over a decade to reach her position, had clawed her way into the rank of Star Captain through sheer force of will. The very idea that a no-named whelp could go over her head and take a position of higher command made her skin crawl, and his presence was sure to make the upcoming inspection a miserably humiliating affair. She had very little good news to report to the Star Colonel, and she could already feel Damien smugly grinning at her as her superior tore her apart for her inadequacies. Danvers tapped her earpiece. "All units, I have visual on the cargo. He is on the move. Stand by and prepare to roll out." Moran was not smiling when he approached. He was examining the infantry squads with reserved skepticism, and he barely acknowledged Danvers when she saluted him. "Star Captain," he said. "You're prepared to receive us, I see." "I humbly request you to bear with the security measures, sir," said Danvers. "I assure you that it is necessary." "A warmer welcome than we receive on most other worlds. Would you not agree, sir?" said Damien. Danvers ground her teeth together. Damien's smile looked innocent enough, a clear demonstration of his calculated charisma. To call the young warrior handsome would have been an insulting understatement. His golden hair was perfectly trimmed, with artfully placed bear patches to accommodate his narrow helmet contacts. His green eyes were utterly spellbinding, and his physique was perfect, even by clan standards. Even Danvers felt herself flush under his emerald gaze, though the attraction only served to add further fuel to her loathing. There was more than one way to put an ambitious young warrior in his place. "It is my desire that everything run as smoothly as possible," said Danvers evenly. "To this end, I will take no chances." She handled the latch on the armored car's rear door and pulled it open. "If you would." Damien and Moran boarded, and Danvers followed after them. Once they were all seated, she tapped her earpiece again. "Package secured. All units, move out." "How far to City Hall?" asked Moran. 5 miles, Danvers replied. "I have the direct route closed down. We should encounter no problems. I put out a false report that you would be arriving 4 days from now. We are ahead of schedule." "A clever tactic," said Damien. "Deny the enemy a chance to prepare. Unorthodox, but effective." "There is much you could learn by observing me," said Danvers, wary of the compliment. "My experience is the quality that won me this position." "Of course." Damien replied with his ever-present smile. Though I suspect the untimely demise of the 3-star captains who previously held this post may have also played a role. Danvers bit her tongue until she tasted blood. Such a comment from any other subordinate would have earned them a fierce slap across the face, but she was not foolish enough to lay a hand on Moran's pet. Moran waved the underhanded comment away, his attention fixed on the view outside his window. Star Captain Danvers is indeed experienced, Damien. You would do well to observe her. That is, after all, why we are here. The armored car began to move. 2 other identical vehicles joined them, one in front and the other behind. A pair of light battle mechs joined the formation in a similar manner, and the motorcade began its journey through Saldana. The road from the spaceport to City Hall was a straight 8-lane highway that ran through a lowered channel. Tall concrete walls rose to meet the foundations of the high-rise buildings, which towered over the road in what was clearly intended to be an impressive display of prosperity. The architecture reflected Curitan sensibilities, a culture that knew all too well the value of first impressions. The skyline had the desired effect, as both Damien and Moran were transfixed by the scenery. A beautiful city, said Damien, much like the planet itself. I can see why the locals are so protective of it. You would not say that if you had been here for its conquest, said Danvers. The defenders scattered like insects before us. Any time they met us in open battle, we swept them aside with ease. It was a battle without glory, over so quickly that they may as well have not even bothered to fight. Yet the ones who remain fight on, said Moran, with a high degree of success, it would seem. A strike here, a raid there, Danvers admitted. The damage is minimal. They are an annoyance, nothing more. Star Captain, I will be perfectly frank with you, said Moran, taking his gaze away from the window and locking it squarely on Danvers. I do not personally oversee the dispensation of annoyances. Lothan has demanded more than twice its allotted resources. The garrison has had to be expanded on 3 separate occasions. I need not remind you that we are a long way from our old homeland, and local recruitment has been problematic. Our manpower is not infinite. Such irritations are to be taken seriously. Of course, sir, said Danvers. I did not mean to make light of the importance of your visit. I simply wish to assure you that the situation is well within my capabilities. There are some voices who disagree, said Damien. Rather loudly, in fact. I understand that a shipment of pulse lasers was intercepted last week. 15 warriors and a battle mech were lost. Let us also not forget that all 3 of your predecessors were assassinated. Warriors regularly go to sleep and never wake up, found in the morning with their throats slit and their equipment stolen. Based on the reports of your subordinates, morale is in critically short supply, and that is just the military side of things. Indeed, said Moran. I have heard constant complaints from the merchant and laborer castes that the local population has been exceedingly uncooperative. Lothan has failed to meet every production quota assigned to it since it fell under our control. Every morning my communiques are filled with reports of sabotage, unruly workers, and even riots. This has not diminished since your assignment. Lothan has proven to be a challenge for every star captain that has overseen it, said Danvers. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat as she continued. We, however, have made progress. I have secured a large sum of funds by incorporating the Lothan Capital Trust Company. The workers there have been successfully integrated into the merchant caste without any complications. I have addressed the sabotage at the import inspection centers, and those responsible have been publicly dealt with. In what way? Asked Moran. We took the criminals into custody, said Danvers. Those found to be responsible for poisoning rations were put to the firing squads. The rest remain incarcerated. Public executions. Damien's smile evaporated. You would prefer another punishment for the crime of murder, Quiaf? Asked Danvers. Damien leaned back in his seat and folded his hands in his lap. His eyes narrowed, and Danvers gained the unnerving sensation that he was looking through her. Tell me, Star Captain, he said, how familiar are you with the history of Rasselhag? Their history is the same as the rest of the Inner Sphere, Danvers replied. A never-ending series of wars, needless waste of life and resources on petty squabbling. Their ignorant past does not interest me. It interests them, Damien countered. Rasselhag is filled with proud and independently minded people. We are not the first conquerors who have taken them in. There is a perfect model of what not to do, should you take the time to learn from it. Enlighten me, Danvers scoffed. The Draconis Combine ruled this area for hundreds of years, said Damien. As the name implies, the rule was, well, draconian. They led with a heavy hand and an even heavier boot. Rasselhag responded with resistance. These people are immune to tactics of intimidation, Star Captain. They have seen it all before and emerged victorious. What would you have me do? Danvers demanded. Crimes must not go unpunished. I acted in the way of the clans. Would you have me break that? Your actions have only emboldened the locals, said Damien flatly. They will resist harder than before. Then they shall meet stiffer resistance. Danvers replied. They will break eventually. The clear superiority of our ways will naturally bring them to heel. It is only a matter of applying the correct methods consistently. Over time it will pay dividends. Time, said Moran, is not on our side. We're nearly there, said the driver. We just passed Point Bravo. Danvers tapped her earpiece, glad to momentarily free herself from the conversation. All units prepare for arrival. Take formation Gamma and... She paused and scowled as a reply cut her off. Aff, this is Star Captain Danvers, you idiot! Who did you think... Her sentence went unfinished. The earpiece detonated with shocking force, splitting the Star Captain's skull into a dozen fragments that decorated the cabin with a red and gray mist. Her corpse slumped headless to the floor, and both Damien and Moran pulled out their sidearms. The startled driver swerved, thinking that they were under fire, and a moment later they were. The upper floors of the buildings on either side of the motorcade erupted in a hail of gunfire. Rockets streaked down from above, and the lead car disappeared in a ball of flame and shredded metal. The battlemech staggered under the assault, relatively undamaged, but caught off guard and thrown off balance. The third car in the column was hit next, and the explosion flung the driver through the windshield like a discarded toy. Up ahead a new threat appeared. A pair of battlemechs, a fire starter and a Shadowhawk, jumped down from the upper level of the city and landed on the road, weapons spraying with wild abandon. The clan mech shrank back from the assault as pulse lasers stabbed into their armor. The lead mech, a Mistlynx, lost one of the Myrmer bundles in its right shoulder, and the limb dangled uselessly from its mounting. The adder that had been protecting the rear of the motorcade returned fire, sending a pair of PPC blasts into the Shadowhawk's shoulder. The autocannon fell away and crashed down onto the highway, crushing an infantryman beneath it as it landed. The fire starter had focused its attention on the stricken Mistlynx. Its jump jets fired, sending it soaring over the damaged mech and its stunned pilot. The battlemech pirouetted in midair, landing between the clan mechs. 4 flamers lashed out and coated the Mistlynx, sending its heat soaring. The Shadowhawk, now deprived of its primary weapon, closed on the Mistlynx, catching it in a swift pincer movement. The medium mech's left fist swung in a terrible arc, and the air was filled with the shriek of mangled steel as the punch connected. The Mistlynx toppled onto its side, helpless as the firestarter continued to bathe it in flame. The adder, now outgunned, backed away and let loose another pair of PPC blasts, this time at the firestarter. The light mech nearly lost its footing as the shots landed firmly in the rear torso, blowing its back open and revealing the reactor housed within. It ceased its attack on the Mistlynx and jumped away, leaping back to the upper city streets and disappearing among the buildings. The Shadowhawk delivered one final burst of pulse laser fire into the downed Mistlynx, then followed after its companion. The fire from the upper levels ceased, and suddenly the highway fell into an eerie calm. The entire exchange had lasted less than a minute, but the damage was severe. Moran sprang out of the armored car and sprinted for the collapsed battlemech with Damien hot on his heels. The mech itself was largely undamaged, save for the crushed armor and melted Myrmer bundle, but its operator was a different story. The Shadowhawk's punch had breached the canopy, and everything inside had been set ablaze by the flamers. The mech warrior sat slumped over in her control couch, the flames eating away what remained of her body. Damien shrank back from the heat, but Moran stood where he was, fists clenched. "Sir," said Damien, "it is not safe here. We must withdraw." "Calm yourself, Damien," said Moran. "The attack is over. It served its purpose." He looked upward and caught a glimpse of something floating down from above. A length of white fabric descended on the wind, and as it fell, Moran could read the words painted on it in crimson letters. This was merely a message. Damien followed his gaze. The banner came to rest on the ground beside the Mistlynx, its blood-colored message plainly visible for all to see. "Welcome to Lothan.